And good evening, everybody, and welcome to another panel brought to you by the Alex Kirsch Project. If you're a new member, do not forget to show this channel some love by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Also, feel free to leave me some comments in the comment section. And if you have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to drop them, and I'll read them as soon as I have the first opportunity. So I'd like to take the time to first welcome our panelists. Our panelists tonight consists of we're going to be welcoming back Fresh Faces, New Ideas. We're also welcoming for the first time STRDST, Twitch streamer and commentator. Also, we're going to welcome in here Malcolm from Goddammit Malcolm and Phoenix. We got another, he's also a Twitch streamer and commentator. So we're waiting on one more panelist, but once he jumps in, we'll just bring him right on in and I'll introduce him as well. So let's go ahead and have all the panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with Fresh Faces.
Hi, I'm Fresh Faces New Ideas. I do political commentary on Twitch. I'll do some gaming at some point, but I got more of an audience for that. I generally stream 1 p.m. EST. I'm trying to do some later streams during the week. I do politics, and I'll talk to pretty much anybody about anything.
Fantastic. Phoenix.
Hey, I'm Academic Punk 17, or you can call me Phoenix. I use they, them pronouns. I stream politics mostly here on Twitch, though since the whole politically provoked drama went down, I've been kind of debate-wise homeless and struggling to put together some of the more interesting content. So we're looking at some other things, and we've been playing a lot of Minecraft. So that's where the channel's at right now. Come join; it'll be fun.
There you go. All right, STRDST.
Hey, I'm STRDST, STRDST_. You can find me on Twitch. I do politics and kind of stream of consciousness streams and the occasional debate. Also host a Chaos Cast every Saturday where we argue about really stupid stuff. I'm here.
Everyone, welcome. All right, and Malcolm.
I'm Malcolm. I go by he, him pronouns. I stream mostly trans political content from a trans masculine perspective. A lot of the time we kind of get left out, or our perspectives or experiences, especially when we're talking about policy. Things like that. So that's primarily what I talk about. I review a lot of like gender critical and turf content, stuff like that. The easiest way to find me is on YouTube at Goddammit Malcolm. And then I stream on Twitch as well, but all my links are spelled funny. So the easiest way to find me is on YouTube.
Yep. And I've also dropped all the links where people can find you, your Twitter accounts and your Twitch or YouTube channel. So if people want to find you, they know exactly where to go to. So, all right. So I just found out from the other panelist that he won't be able to make it tonight. There was miscommunication. It's not his fault. It is what it is. So we'll just proceed from there. So once again, I want to take the time. Thank you all for joining me this evening for us to talk about this issue. So tonight's issue is mental health, the hidden scars. Now, as someone who can speak from experience, I can definitely tell you that mental health is something that isn't nearly talked about enough. I have seen firsthand soldiers and veterans that have had breakdowns because of things they saw during wartime. I have also seen soldiers who have been at the absolute end of their rope. I've had friends, people I've served with, that ended their own lives because they just couldn't take the mental trauma anymore. Many people try to be stoic and just think that they just need to get their act together, but it isn't that simple. As of this year, according to the Mental Health America website, 9.7% of youth in the U.S. have severe major depression. 60% of youth with major depression still didn't get any mental health treatment from 2017 to 2019. 23.6% of adults reported unmet needed treatment in the same time frame. Depression rates have skyrocketed during COVID in 2020, with 8 out of 10 people took an anxiety screen scoring with moderate to severe symptoms. In March 2020, over 178,000 people have reported suicidal ideations. Rates of suicide are highest among youth to include the LGBTQ+. From January to September of 2020, 77,470 youth reported experienced frequent suicidal ideation, with 27,980 being the youth. According to Military Times, researchers have estimated 30,177 global war and terror veterans have died by suicide, compared to the 7,057 who have died while deployed in support of the war on terror. Lastly, whenever a mass shooting takes place, the main excuse that comes up is that the person was just a nutcase. But we just tend to just leave it at that. It's just a crazy person. So we're now going to give each of the panelists 1 to 5 minutes to give their thoughts on the stigma of mental health, how they feel mental health is treated in this country, and what they think we as a society should do to take mental health a little bit more seriously. And we are going to start with STRDST.
Right. So I think that as a country, we probably do better than a lot of other countries, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for a lot of improvement, which there is room for a lot of improvement. I think we're still kind of dealing with like the stigma around mental illnesses, and that prevents a lot of people from getting treatment, getting the help that they need. And I find that a lot of the people who are struggling the most don't have the means to seek out support, seek out resources to help them.
Okay, thank you. All right, next we are going to have, Fresh. Go ahead.
Look, it's too often, I think, used as a way to bludgeon people in a negative context. It's something that really needs to be viewed through a more sympathetic light, and something that needs to, be treated the same way as physical health. If you have an issue, it shouldn't be stigmatized. It should be, how do we help fix it? And instead of being used as a hand waving tool or a way to minimize other people, it's something that we as a country need to spend more time focusing on and making sure that it's taken care of. And it shouldn't just be used as a tool to ignore other social issues to say, oh, well, this is happening, so we can't focus on something else.
Thank you. Phoenix.
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues that come to mental health in the United States. Obviously, like Stardust said, the United States isn't the worst country. However, compared to the economic power and general other potentiality that we have to help our citizens, the fact that we don't, to the extent that even the Nordic countries do, or even that they do in the UK or some of these other relatively conservative countries on the developed index. But from the United States perspective, one of the big things we can do, we know that mental health directly correlates with class in a lot of ways. Simply remembering that helping class issues always is going to help all of these issues. Mm-hmm. I think that in general, mental health is really stigmatized in the United States, just because there's a sense of ableism that still really flows through every institution, and especially that conflicts with our sort of that accepting differently or disabled people it somehow undermines this idea that every worker should be making the absolute maximum that they can at all times. That those come into conflict. And broadly, I think obviously it correlates with LGBT stuff, with other issues and other things that we want to shove down. And I think finally, mental health is just believed to be, there's sort of a toxic masculinity piece to it, right? That like men especially, and it also exists with women, and there's an aspect of it that comes in toxic femininity in a different way, but the idea that there's an expectation to be strong, to make sure that you can always get through and always put on a brave face and put it in front of everybody, sets a lot of expectations that aren't necessarily possible for everyone to meet. My hope would be that we could as a society put more value into mental health. And as far as policies go, I think that a lot more mental health education in school, a lot more access to mental health care, and better class conditions overall are probably like the ways forward.
Okay, thank you. Malcolm.
I think the biggest issue that comes with mental health, specifically in the Western world, like specifically the United States, is mainly accessibility. So I think for the most part, we've kind of moved away from a lot of the stigmatization around mental illness. I think it still exists to a certain degree, but I think the biggest barrier is going to be people being able to access the care that they need. I know, for example, that a lot of people will self-diagnose or self-medicate a lot of mental conditions. Like I have a lot of friends personally that will like microdose mushrooms or microdose cannabis, things like that, because they're not able to afford like prescription medication to like alleviate their symptoms. So I think that the biggest angle to kind of encompass better mental health treatment for everybody is just going to be like accessibility and affordability, because those are like the two big barriers for people to get the help that they need, like across the board.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time. And it looks like Jason was able to join us after all. So Jason, welcome to the panel. A little bit of history between Jason and I. Him and I served together in Iraq in 2006, and he's become a really good friend of mine. And Jason, go ahead and introduce yourself.
So my name's Jason, and As Alex said, I served in Iraq with them. We were field artillerymen. Got out, went to college, got my undergrad in history, went and got a graduate in clinical counseling. I worked for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline for a little while. Did various things. I was a registered substance abuse counselor in the state of California. Worked at a methadone clinic. Now I work for the VA at the Veterans Crisis Line. So the opinions and things that I say here aren't endorsed by the government. They're basically just, they come from my own knowledge and experience.
Appreciate it, man. Glad to have you on here. So everyone's kind of given an opening statement on how they feel mental health is treated in this country and how we as a society should do to make mental health be taken more seriously. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we still have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of people, and it's not just society as a whole that sees it as a taboo. It's also a cultural thing. There's a lot of cultures that we have coming into the United States to where it's taboo for them. It's not something that you really let outside of that family unit when you have a mental health problem. And I mean, we definitely need to work on it. We need to break down that barrier. We need to make it more like, it's just as normal as going to see a doctor for a cold. That's all it is. You take insulin for diabetes, okay, might be a little depressed, might need a little Prozac. Nothing wrong with that. When that depression leaves, you can wean that Prozac down.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right, so now we're going to go into the questions, okay? So each question, you're going to have up to about 3 minutes to answer these questions, but if you need a little bit extra time, just let me know. So the first question, and this is going to go to Malcolm. Do you think the U.S. is in step with the rest of the world in regards to mental health, or are we faring better or worse? I know you kind of everyone's kind of answered that in their initial question, but if you want to specify further into it, please do.
I think that other countries run into similar barriers, like with the stigmatization aspect. To my understanding, like a lot of other countries have better social safety nets for like mentally or physically disabled people, so they can, not be worked to death essentially the way that we are in the U.S. I know that getting like disability and stuff like that, disability doesn't cover much of anything. I think that I think that like in the US specifically, it's going to be like accessibility to like affordable care. But I think like globally or like even just in other places in the West, the stigmatization still exists. I think the biggest barrier, at least in America though, is just like access to care.
All right. Thank you. Fresh.
Yeah, I'm echoing what he said. It's a lot about the ability to get access to the care so that we're not, self-diagnosing off of WebMD to find out we have cancer whenever we go online. It's accessibility, and then it's the cost of actually, being able to afford some of the medicines. And it's mostly the healthcare system, and then it's not using it as a cudgel to not to beat people down.
Okay, Phoenix.
Yeah. So as far as our comparisons to other countries, I think that if we wanted to look at the big extreme of like where the Nordic countries where everything is perfect and they live in a utopia, ignore the suicide rates, and where they have like actual mental health care and they have better abilities and disabilities. And then we come to America and it's this conservative like hellhole. But again, looking at the UK or somebody perhaps who's a little bit more in step with the United States, we definitely, I think that the big thing, even though I do think that there's probably more stigma than seems to be like than Malcolm seems to want to talk about, I would agree with the prescription that material access is definitely the biggest problem in the United States. Is somebody whose medical care access is through Medicaid. I can speak to that being not exactly optimally functioning. So
okay, completely fair. Stardust.
Yeah. So I think everybody here's brought up some really good points. One thing I would bring up is the lack of accessibility for people in rural areas. So if you go to any rural area in America, there is not just a lack of like mental health care, there's just a lack of health care in general. The doctor to patient ratio is really bad. The nurse to patient ratio is really bad. And with COVID and how everything has kind of played out with this pandemic, we have an even larger shortage of medical workers than we did initially. I think that also we can learn something, although other cultures may have more stigmas towards mental health and towards mental illnesses, you will find cultures where they don't have the same accessibility to medicine. They at least have a culture where they take care of their family. And if somebody is sick, people have a sense of duty towards each other to take care of each other, to house each other, to make sure that family member is going to be able to live, basically. So I think there are things that we can take. Obviously, the stigmatization is not something that we can take from those cultures, and we see that really everywhere. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jason. What do you think? He's probably still muted. Jason, I think you're muted.
Oh, I am totally muted. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No worries.
You know, I wish I could say more about the healthcare system in other countries. I really haven't observed it. I've observed it here at home, and I think that the panelist before me, Stardust, was that your name?
Yes.
Okay. I think that she hit a really good point that we do have a problem with rural communities. There's a lot less access out there. And, you know, with COVID, that's brought a whole new dynamic. So it's a plus and a negative, because it's done a lot for the social isolation aspect, which has really, made, very, minor cases of depression or anxiety that much more worse because nobody's getting out.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also showed us that technology could help us to an advantage, because now, we have other services like the service I work for, but also the tech services. There's other telehealth services out there that we're going to start to see blossoming, and hopefully, that will be able to help alleviate some of the pressure that the isolation and COVID has brought to us.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really took a toll on society. So my next question, this is going to come straight to you, Jason, okay? There are critics out there that are saying people who suffer from anxiety or depression are just people who are snowflakes that should just suck it up and drive on. It's more about just toughing it out instead of just actually needing to be medicated. Do you think this is a real thing, or are we just not taking it seriously enough at times, do you think?
I think that we just don't take it serious enough at times. And I think that there are some cases out there. Some people do benefit from being medicated and from having some type of medical assistant treatment. But also on that same note too, I think that, if you put somebody in that therapeutic setting to where they could just learn, some coping skills, and, they're not going to learn that by being stigmatized and being called a snowflake or, a variety of other words. But, in a therapeutic setting where they feel good and they feel supported and they have a good relationship with the person they're working with, I think that, their resolve can be strengthened to a point to where they can handle it. And, it can come to a point to where they can overcome it.
Agreed. Phoenix.
Yeah. So the short answer to this is that I generally think that we don't take it seriously enough. I'll agree with Jason, because I think what Jason was trying to get at there was that specifically medication and prescription drugs for mental health are probably, broadly speaking, with nuance for different mental illnesses, overprescribed due to the fact that it is much more profitable for a drug company to be able to sell a drug than for a treatment to have to work through the therapist payment system and the health insurance, blah, blah, blah. Drugs like money making machines. So I think that there's probably some incentive for that in the market. But I think culturally speaking, it's usually more so the case that the non-economic cultural biases tend towards a delegitimization of mental health that's unnecessary, even if it were true. Like, if, like, just to take it on the face, like, do you probably just need to suck it up? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like when you learn to deal with a mental illness, what you do. It's not like that simple, don't get me wrong. It's not like you have to not have your emotions or whatever, but you have to learn how to like process, get through, and not like dwell on that, right? And it's not that easy, but that's my point, is that it's not so much that this claim is like factually wrong, so much as it's just consequentially unhelpful. Like, what are you doing? You're not actually making a positive difference with this person. I take kind of the same position just in general with like the prison system, right? Like, why do we do these things that lead to like such a high recidivism rate, right? Like, what's the point of locking them up for longer if it doesn't actually affect recidivism? General things like this, I wish people would think more about the consequences rather than who deserves what.
Okay, thank you. Malcolm.
Could you restate the question, please?
Sure.
I kind of was writing down what other people were saying. I kind of missed it.
No, it's okay. So basically, it's just talk about like how critics out there are saying people who suffer from like anxiety or depression are just people that are snowflakes and just need to suck it up, and they just need to just tough it out instead of needing to be medicated. Do you think that's like a real thing, or are we just not take it seriously enough?
I think it depends on who you talk to, because I think that there are certain people that think that mental illness is just kind of like a symptom of like material conditions. Like, people are like, oh, well, you're sad because, you know, like, you don't have a partner, or you're sad because you don't have like a college degree, so it's difficult for you to get a job. And then there are people that will say that like, oh, some of these mental illnesses are like kind of innate. I think for the most part, I think a lot of people are on board, like, societally, with the idea that people need to just suck it up, get over with it. Like, you can just go to work, you know, it'll be fine, that kind of thing. But I think there's more of a shift towards accepting mental illnesses, at least as far as I want to say like in regards to like social aspects. Like, if you're like, oh, I can't come into work today, like I have like a therapist appointment, like we kind of glorify or at least people that I know, because I work in the mental health field, will kind of be like, you know, like getting a therapist is a good thing. Like, going and talking to somebody, even if you don't have like a serious mental illness, is a good thing. Again, it comes back to, I think, that barrier of accessibility, where like, yeah, that would be great if everybody could go to a therapist and, you know, like talk about their problems, or maybe have access to like medicine if they need it. But the accessibility to get to that point is like kind of what hinders people. So I think a lot of it comes from people perceiving it as a lack of effort to get better. So I think that they kind of play with each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It does make sense. Yeah, I think you made a really solid point there as well, too. So, Fresh, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with most of what's been said, especially like the Phoenix's point, that the idea that, you know, sometimes it is a little bit easier to overprescribe than it is to like actually deal with the impacts of it, and also the use of like suck it up. There are things like you can that you'll get through, but sometimes you just got to talk to somebody, whether it's a family member, whether it's a crisis counselor, whether it's a therapist, and there shouldn't be any stigma involved in that. No single person can go through life entirely on their own without any help. So if it's, you know, there should be no difference from, you know, going to a physical trainer to get something stronger, or going to a doctor, than there is to a therapist. And minimizing it is a good way for people who can't figure out, because there are people who have issues and they need to walk through it, and saying, oh, you know, you're just not strong enough, or you're just being a snowflake, you just need to suck it up, could spiral them worse into worse outcomes. It's not people don't, I mean, I'm sure there are some examples, but more likely you need a positive impact on it than a negative perception.
Agreed. Stardust.
Maybe.
I find this actually is a really interesting question, because what the common narrative used to be is that, oh, well, you should just suck it up. You know, you need to suck it up. And that was kind of like the prevailing thing with people who were kind of in denial of it. Right now, I find it super interesting, because there's a different type of denial that I've seen kind of emerging, where it's like people, for example, will take these illnesses that they have and make that their identity, and then choose to not treat it because it's part of their identity. Why should I treat this if this is who I am, you know? And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. And it's I don't know if you guys have seen like the DID groups and things like that, where people say, you know, we don't need therapy. These are all valid, you know, valid identities and all of that. And we don't need any medical help. Right. So I think it's super interesting. There are multiple like narratives popping up now where it's just denialism. It seems like it's like my identity is valid and therefore I shouldn't have to seek treatment for this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
really quickly,
go ahead.
broadly, while I agree with your point, DID specifically, functionally, each of those alters acts like as a person. And while legally it's hard to like classify it as that, medically the recommendation is to like treat them all like individual people within a system.
Right. But the only thing is that people don't even seek treatment, right? They don't even seek medical.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then with DID specifically, the overall goal of like any kind of therapeutic practice for somebody that has OSDD or DID is integration into like one singular body. It's not to like treat the ailments of like each individual alter. It's the ultimate goal is integration to make it back into like a whole person that doesn't have fragmented parts of their personalities as well.
But the integration also involves working through the individual problems of each alter. That's like part of how that process occurs.
No, I know, but what I'm saying
Sure.
is like the end goal is like integration. It's not to like treat individually specific like things that each alter has going on and treat each alter as like an individual distinct personality, but it's to treat them as like a fragment of the individual person. So like trauma counseling and trauma therapy, like specifically related to OSDD and DID, the primary goal is integration. And you can do that through like individual practices, like with each specific alter, but they don't treat them as individual persons because they're not individual persons. They're fragments of the specific personality that was fragmented via trauma.
What were we gonna say, Stardust?
Yeah, I was going to say, sure. Yes. Like, you know, maybe initially the way that medical professionals handle this is to treat each alter as this fragment and focus on each alter. But at the end of the day, what I find incredibly problematic is that this becomes an identity for people. And because they make it their identity, they don't seek out further medical treatment for it, which is incredibly dangerous because you can look at any household where there's like a parent with untreated mental illness, and I'm pretty sure you could look at the correlation of like child abuse, and you would see something, you know, heavily correlated. So,
like I said, I agree with the broader point. I just wanted to say like that the idea that we should treat each alter as like a human being worthy of its own individual respect is like not one that's controversial necessarily. Obviously in a therapy setting there's differences, but like in a functional day-to-day setting.
Yeah, and I can honestly say, like, and I'm speaking from personal experience, I can definitely say that therapy is completely underrated. Like, I've used therapy services, and it helped me out greatly, actually. So, anybody else had anything to follow up with before we go to the next topic?
I missed pretty much everything she said. I got bounced.
It's okay.
But the only thing I would just say is, I think a lot of my stuff just crashed. The only thing I would ask is, when I know you're referring to actual, you were referring to a specific thing, but just general people not taking using it as part of that identity is problematic. Like, I understand what you're saying from that, and even if you're talking about it through that lens, regardless of the symptoms, not treating it in any way and just saying, "Oh, this is just who I am," is basically as bad as saying just suck it up, because you're not.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't really have more to add to that. I apologize that I missed whatever you were saying.
It was essentially the same thing. You got the point, even if you didn't hear it. That essentially that's like the new narrative that I see popping up. It's either if there's denialism, then it's either, oh, suck it up, or this is a valid identity. This is who I am. So you have to accept me as I am, even though I'm, ill. So, yeah.
But it's also a breakdown further into tribalism. It's not just
Yeah.
Mental health is it's a, you know, you can find people breaking down those into identities across political lines. You can do it, you know, across job lines. Like it's an overall coping mechanism. It's not just specifically for mental health. The problem is when you're doing something like mental health, the negative impacts that come from just, you know, saying I'm this way and that's how I am.
Completely fair. All right, next question. So this is going to come to Phoenix first. So we focus a lot on the PTSD in regards to veterans, police officers, firefighters, people that essentially sign a dotted line to put their lives at risk. And I'm really glad that, you know, they're trying to put more emphasis into recognizing that post-traumatic stress is a real thing with people that put their lives on the line. But do you think sometimes we tend to, I wouldn't say ignore, but do you think sometimes we forget about other people that suffer from PTSD? For example, school shooting victims, EMTs, people that have, you know, victims of sexual assault, or people that have gotten in car crashes. Do you think that we kind of, you know, put the spotlight on people that serve their countries or sign the dotted line, put their lives at risk, but not enough emphasis on those that didn't ask for that? They just, like, for example, Parkland School in Florida, you know, a lot of those kids, like even David Hogg has been mocked for, like, what was it? Like, people kind of make fun of him because he's a school, and he keeps on emphasizing that he's a school shooting victim, which I think is wrong. But do you think sometimes we kind of push those people off to the side and put the spotlight on one group of people?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that go into this. I would say that the big thing with that, though, is that I don't know that it's necessarily like an intentional sidelining or anything like that, so much as it's about a rhetorical image that pro mental health people have had to use just to win popularity, right? The idea of having mentally unwell associated with a military hero or a cop hero, or even like a firefighter. Firefighter is the perfect uncontroversial image of like the masculine archetype, and to say like even this person can need treatment went a long way for making it so that that mental health was less stigmatized, and B, that so like that it was just more acceptable, and B, that it wasn't relegated to only like weak people who hadn't really had an effect with it, because it meant now we could use PTSD to show that this was a sort of masculine, manly issue just as much as it was anything else. It's an unfortunate like thing that we have to capitulate to, but it's like when we want us to pull out of the Middle East, but we can't talk about all the brown children that died because nobody cares. So we have to talk about all the US troops that died. Like, yes, I would care to talk about the brown children that died, and I would care to talk about the Parkland shooting and whatnot, but I think we do have to take it one step at a time. I think now would be the time to make that rhetorical shift, but I understand why that narrative was brought about.
Okay, completely fair. All right, Malcolm.
I think a lot of this kind of sentiment comes from the idea where people will frame people that struggle with mental illness like while they're out like doing things or pursuing treatment, or like even if they have like a form of PTSD that doesn't come from like war or like being an active service veteran or anything like that. It's kind of that where people will be like, well, not as brave as our troops. Like it becomes that sliding scale of like, well, how traumatic was it? Like, does it actually impact impact your life? Because I think conceptually people can look across the board and say like, okay, like you were in Sandy Hook, like you probably have PTSD, like obviously, or like, oh, you were in like Afghanistan, you might have PTSD, probably so, right? Based on like the horrible things that you had to do. But it's hard for people to translate that into like you experience like a traumatic thing happen in your life. Like I had a friend that got in a really bad car crash, and so she doesn't ride in cars anymore, and that's like a form of PTSD, right?
Yes.
I think that it's hard because people want to make it out that like my threshold for trauma might not be the same threshold for what would be traumatic for you. So like for me, maybe like getting in a car accident was the most traumatic thing that happened, but maybe for somebody who served in like the military, the most traumatic thing was like, you know, they watch all of their friends get blown into a billion bits like right in front of them. Both of those things can provoke like negative outcomes, like mental health wise. But I think that we like to do like the measurement where it's like, well, that happened to me and I'm not traumatized at all. I think it's like kind of that it's almost like a competitive nature. And I think that that's something that's really prevalent when we talk about mental health, where it's like, oh yeah, well, my mom died too, and I'm totally fine, but it might have not been in the same capacity. It might have affected you differently. I think getting rid of like the hierarchy of like how traumatized somebody needs to be in order to like have this condition would be something that I think could help with that.
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons I brought it up, because that's what tends to happen. It's like, oh yeah, well, this happened to me, so whatever. So Stardust.
I think that was a really good point on this different threshold that different people have. And just because somebody maybe has less of a threshold doesn't mean that PTSD doesn't affect them just as much. Or even just because somebody wasn't serving doesn't mean that they didn't have some horrible experience, like an abusive household or something like that, or like a relationship or something that would give them that would greatly impact their quality of life, right? But I don't think that means like we stop focusing on people who were in combat and people who were overseas. I think that it's important we just kind of approach it from a holistic sense. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, completely fair. Jason.
I totally agree with our panelists. I think that, police, military, firefighters, our first responders, just, kind of to make it more palatable to the American public. It was like, okay, here's a population that, we glorify, they're heroic, we remember 9/11. So to come back with these traumas, and, again, society kind of overgeneralizes that, because then it's like, oh, you were in the military, so you must have PTSD. But, anyway, there's that overgeneralization, but there's also that missing population within our general public, battered women, children who grow up in abusive homes, to where, you're 3 years old and you watch, your parents beating each other up, and you think that dad's going to kill mom, and you see that every day for a number of years. Next thing you know, thinking about it constantly, feeling your life is threatened. Those are all signs of PTSD, but that person didn't serve in the military. So yeah, I think that, for the American public, and to market mental health a little better, we associate it more with those frontline responders, those heroics. But, it touches more of our society than we care to admit.
Okay, absolutely.
Do you mind if I add on to that, or do you want to move on?
I'll have Fresh go first, and then you can add on, if that's okay. So go ahead, Fresh.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. It's mostly like when they were talking about it, downplaying sometimes the people like David Hogg, it's to downplay the overall seriousness of an actual issue that we have to face with, because it's like, okay, well, this person is overreacting to it. Another way that this was done was, and this is not directly like a, I don't know how ultimately would be like a PTSD thing, but it's something else that's used to, you take somebody else's feelings as a way to downplay an overall thing. And one of the ways is that was AOC's response to January 6th, where she said one of her fears was she was potentially going to be raped. And they're like, oh, well, she's making all this up. This is all nonsense. And it was used as an overall way to lessen a more horrific issue. So it's taking someone's personal trauma and say, oh, it doesn't matter because whatever you're dealing with isn't as bad.
Okay, go ahead, Phoenix.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because you mentioned the idea of like ways that traumas can be hidden, and one of them being like the actual action happening to somebody else. Another big way that the trauma can be hidden is that if not all traumas are acute, like we typically like to imagine, that a specific instance happens and that creates the trauma. A lot of the time in practice, trauma is built up over a period of time without you realizing that you're like experiencing trauma. And I think that also gets really ignored pretty often.
I agree. That's one of the reasons I brought this question up, is because people trying to prioritize what's more important for us to focus on. So, and that's why I think it's such an important question. So, next question. Okay, Stardust, is going to come to you first. Okay, so during this most recent Olympics, we saw Simone Biles, who is without a doubt one of the best athletes in the country. She caught a lot of flack for her withdrawing from the team events at the Olympics because she was not allowed to bring her ADHD medication into Japan, which could have had a huge impact on her performance. She still finished in the individual events, but she was still mocked. people like to bring up how Carrie Strug persevered and put her body on the line and actually severely injured her ankle. And critics of Biles has called her selfish, and she should just suck it up. And remember, she is representing her country. Carrie Strug, however, sent support to Simone Biles, saying she was proud of her for making a decision, because Carrie Strug actually told her, it's like, she made a decision that we were not afforded back in her day, talking about specifically the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. So the next question is, was Simone Biles justified in her decision, or are we just, expecting athletes to just represent your country and just to suck it up once again? Go ahead, Stardust.
Yeah, I think that she was justified in her decision. It is her body at the end of the day. It's nobody else's body. Nobody else owns her body. And she already had a injury a couple of years prior to her ankle, if I recall correctly. So I know one of the issues, if she didn't have her ADHD medicine, I'm sure that, it's harder for her to focus on, and there's like a whole bunch of things that go into these things when athletes are I guess performing these things. So yeah, I think she's justified. I think at the end of the day that might not even be like a coming down to mental health. I think that just comes down to her personal bodily autonomy. So
okay, Jason.
I agree with Stardust. I mean, it's her decision. It comes down to her body, and it's really, I mean, does she want to make that selfless sacrifice to, put herself on the line? And I mean, I don't blame her at all. She had a choice to make, and she made a decision, and she stands by her decision. And I personally don't feel that it's right to ridicule her for trying to step out for her own mental health. I think that's a lot of the problems that we're having in society related to mental health.
I agree. Fresh.
Well, first off, the people who were mocking her for being weak, we have to remember these people are like superhumans in comparison to us. The ability for them to do the things that they do is on a whole nother level. There's also a lot more that goes into this. So the fact that the Olympics had to be moved for another year throws off their whole training regimen. So these are people who understand their bodies better than anybody else anyway to be able to compete at this level. So if she understood that she couldn't do it, there is no reason for her to do this and potentially put herself at risk, because she's even regardless of the fact that she's like widely considered the best ever. It's her body. She's like 24, I think. She's like super young. She could very easily do it again. We have other athletes who are, if not as good as she is, because she's the best, are more phenomenal than anyone else who's commentating. And there's terms for this. I think in gymnastics, it's called the spins. And in other sports, it's called the yips. Another really good example of this that people kind of forget is Markel Fultz. Markel Fultz was the #1 draft pick like 4 or 5 years ago. He was considered a fantastic point guard. One of his big things was the ability to shoot. However, when he showed up at Philly, he started getting these shoulder issues that changed up his shot and basically washed him out of the league in Philly. And for years, he could not do the thing he was supposed to do. And he was so scrutinized, and there was so much talk about it. It's these athletes are just expected to be automatons and go out there, run, depending on what sport, run to X, Y, hit ball B or C. But they're people. You have to understand that on top of being able to be fit, understanding their body, they have a lot of mental stress that regular people aren't dealing with.
I agree. Absolutely. Phoenix.
Yeah, so to add on to what Fresh Face was saying, it's actually called the twisties, not the spins. But in gymnastics, this is a thing. It's the yips in baseball. This is just a known thing that every once in a while, big star athletes have some sort of mental health episode and they can't perform at top tier. They'll still perform way the fuck better than you or me, but they can't perform at their top tier. And this is obviously like a self-perpetuating thing. If once you like can't perform, that affects your ability to like be confident, given that you're an Olympic athlete and your entire existence is on your ability to perform. And generally, this just doesn't seem to lead to good consequences. On top of this, it doesn't even seem to like if she were to stay, it doesn't seem like it would be good for us. It seems like she knows that she can't perform at a top tier. Like it's probably, she's not going to be doing the country a favor by going out there and performing at like way worse than like is reasonable. It's probably better for her and for the U.S. Like if you care about the U.S. Olympics team or whatever, to have her come back in 4 years and not fuck everything up this year.
Absolutely. Malcolm.
I agree with pretty much everything else. The only thing that I think was something that I thought was really interesting that I didn't know was that they wouldn't let her take her ADHD medication to Japan, which is like pretty fucked up. I think that that's kind of like the crux of the issue. Like she should have been able to bring her medication in. And I think something else that I think it was Stardust talked about a little bit earlier. I don't really remember who said it. But that she's really young. So like if she did go through with this and like fuck up her body, that could be like her future career, right? Because there are opportunities for her to go back and perform like at later dates. But if she went through and, you know, she wasn't feeling 100 and she fucked something up really bad, then that's like her whole career. And I think that should take priority, like looking forward, like what can I do in the future? Like, do I really want to jeopardize that? And then also just like making sure like, hey, like I don't feel like doing this right now. And I don't feel like I'm going to be able to do it. So I'm just not going to fuck with it because it could just unintentionally like ruin her career at such a young age.
Absolutely. And kind of like why I brought up Carrie Strug is because everybody looks at Carrie Strug. She was the one that persevered and she, you know, landed on the ankle and you saw her like lift her leg up. What people don't realize is she actually had to retire after that because it had like long lasting damage to her. And that's why she's showing so much support behind Simone Biles, saying she had the courage to do something that we didn't have the courage, because those young ladies were pushed, you know, from young ages to be the best. And some of them actually suffered from some forms of abuse from that. And that's kind of the reasons why I brought this up, because we always like to be critical of the athletes, but we don't see what goes on behind those closed doors. So did anybody else have anything else to add to before you go into the next question?
Yeah, can I add something really quick? Something we didn't bring up that I also forgot about was she was also, I believe, one of the people who was abused by that doctor.
Oh, yeah.
And that is, I mean, that's only what, 4 years or 3 years out from that. That wasn't too long ago. So that's another thing that, you know, she has to deal with on top of being,
Absolutely.
you know, in all of this. So I imagine, I don't know what type of counseling or whatever they're going through for that. But that is just another mental issue that she has to take care of on top of all the pressure of being, you know, a world-class Olympic athlete.
Another thing too, really quick, I think it's really interesting because a lot of the people that were saying like, oh, you know, she should just suck it up. She's representing America, like so on and so forth. Like, you know, we don't want like pussies at the Olympics or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people that will look to places like China or Russia where they have kids like at a really young age start training for Olympic events and they basically like breed Olympians. And they're like, that's authoritarian. That's ridiculous. That's dangerous. You can't just force kids to perform. But then when it's, you know, it's just a 180 when it's Simone Biles. I just thought that was ironic.
Absolutely. All right. So, next question, and this is going to come to you, Fresh, first, okay? So there is research being conducted right now about professional athletes, once again, who suffer from concussions or from some traumatic brain injuries. If left untreated, can actually lead to domestic violence. We've seen it with football players, which as of right now, the number of domestic violence accounts for 48% of arrests for violent crimes in the NFL. And TBI is what has been led to believe what may have caused Chris Benoit to commit murder-suicide, essentially. He killed his family, then he killed himself. We watch sports to be entertained, but we do not do enough when it comes down to athletes. Now, I know this TBI is also an issue within the military, but we recognize this. But do we recognize this as well for athletes, do you think?
Oh, well, no. First off, it's been a while since I've actually looked into the concussion issue for the NFL. My understanding originally was they kind of hid it from the players.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big thing. And then recently the NFL had to change a ruling that African-American players had a lower cognitive functioning. They had a lower level of what they considered acceptable cognitive function. So it was easier for them to get back on the field when they might be concussed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said earlier, we treat them kind of like they're robots. You know, you go, you know, jump off the balance beam, you go catch the football, you go dunk the basketball, but they have, you know, they're people, they have other issues. You watch things break apart and then you just use it as drama, or you watch them like collapse and then they have serious injuries that affect their careers. Another thing we think of, like if someone gets an ACL tear or they hurt something in their body where they're out for a long period of time, whether it's an ACL tear or about a decade ago when Paul George's legs like snapped in half when he went up for a dunk, the phrase we use is, do you trust your body? So it should be the same thing as your mental health. Like, do you trust your own mind? If if you're not like confident in how you feel, why should that be treated different than if you don't you're not confident in how your body's going to perform.
Malcolm?
I'm trying to look this up right now, but I can't find anything on it right now. But I'd be really curious. Does anybody know what like the domestic violence rates are for women that have traumatic brain injuries?
That I
The
couldn't
what?
tell you.
Just because I think that it is interesting, and I think that if this is something that leads to like greater likelihoods of like domestic violence, so like if you're a football player, or like even like a boxer or whatever, and you take a lot of hits to the face, and there's like a potentiality like down the line for you to become like more aggressive or more violent, I think that should be like something that is included in like some kind of like onboarding, like waivers or something like that. That way, like partners are aware that this is like, hey, like if your husband plays football for too long, he might get a concussion and turn violent. But I'm curious if that's just like something that occurs, like if it's like if the statistics would match with like the female population, like if there are like women that have traumatic brain injuries that also engage in higher levels of domestic violence. I'd be really interested to see that. That's what I'm trying to look up right now, but you guys can go on while I look for that. Sorry.
I'm also very curious with that, to what extent that's from the brain injury, because it's got to be hard to like statistically rule out the possibility that it's from like mental conditioning from playing football that aggressively for that long.
Well, it was
if I can, I would need to see like if what this mental conditioning is. I've never heard of mental conditioning in football that would like lead somebody to.
It's the hyperaggression, I imagine. That's probably what he's talking about. It's because having played and then my brother played, it's a very like mentally you have to understand where the like you have to be bigger and better and badder than everything. It's meaner and it's a lot of you got to go out and kill type of mentality.
Yep. Anyway, it was your go, Phoenix. Anyway, so did you have anything else that you wanted to add into that?
Sure. I'm very curious about like the specifics of that study, but in general, yeah, I think that that this is all part of the broader structure, right? That under capitalism we assume that, or we expect that the absolute most be extracted out of every worker, even with this like, and especially under American culture, but even with these like celebrities, these like stars who are supposed to have escaped the like, the poverty grind, if you will, they're still treated as these people to extract as much value from as possible.
Okay. Stardust.
Yeah, I think that there is still a pervasive culture where we allow in general women are still like in a secondary status a lot of the time to men, and I think we still kind of have a pervasive culture where a lot of people find it acceptable to lash out on their significant other or their children, and I think that it's definitely, there's probably something coming into play with all the traumatic brain injuries that people have, for sure, 100%. But I think we also have to look at our culture and how we deal with this. So
couldn't agree more. Jason.
Yeah.
All right. Can you repeat the question?
It was just basically talking about like how TBI is tied in with domestic violence, which accounts for 48% of arrests for violent crimes in the NFL. And talked about Chris Benoit, the famous professional wrestler, that they believe TBI was a contributing factor to him committing murder-suicide. And I know it's also an issue with those that suffer from TBI from IED explosions and TBI from the military service. But when it comes down to like professional athletes, we watch to be entertained, but do we not look out enough for the athletes, and does it kind of tie in together, do you think?
I really don't think that we do look out for the athletes, but also I think that when you're performing at that highest level and you're actually able to get up there and be in front of all those people, there's a part of you that's like, okay, I'm finally here. I'm going to do this. And, again, I mean, it's up to that person. It's that person's own decision. They have the right to step down from that stage and say, hey, you know what? I got here. this is all I needed to do. This is as far as I needed to go. I proved it to myself. And there are others that are just like, you know what? I'm going to be the best. I'm going to push myself until I completely break down. You know, that's what we see. They completely break down, and then 20 years later, they're living with those repercussions of it. Yeah. And, you know, that TBI, that lowering the frustration threshold, gets them in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I agree. Did anybody want to go ahead, Fresh?
Yeah, and another thing also is when we're talking about athletes, it's especially if we're talking about ones from like a lower economic standard, they see the sports as a way to escape. So even let's say you only make it to a college level and you're not, you know, good enough to make it to the next level or make enough money to, you know, because you have this pressure, you know, I got to bring my whole family up, I got to bring my whole, you know, neighborhood up. That could also lead to some of these issues, not directly the actual, not all the actual issues of the physical trauma of the brain injury, but the actual pressure on them to be the one that, you know, he made it out. He's the one who, you know, they made it out. They, you know, buy your mom a car, buy your, you know, save your school, whatever it is. That is another thing that is another impact on them as well.
Agree. Did anybody else have anything else to add before we move on to the next question?
I threw something up in chat. It was just something that I found really quick about women with TBI, and they don't exhibit like the same amounts of like aggression or violence that men do. I think kind of piggybacking off of what Fresh said a little bit is I think that something to be mindful of is that it might not be like the results of people participating in this institution. It might be like the types of people that are drawn to like this kind of activity. So like if you look at like domestic violence rates for like police officers, they're ridiculously high, right? Like, is it that like being a cop makes you a domestic abuser, or is that people that have like a propensity towards that type of behavior happen to settle on like that profession? I think that's something to be mindful of as well. Like if we're talking about aggressive sports like football or like contact sports like boxing, things like that, I think that like the predilection might play into it just as much as like the results of like getting punched in the face too many times, just because we don't see the same rates of IPV in women with TBIs.
I think even if the latter is true, it kind of leads to the former necessarily, as in like if the people that are drawn to this type of activity tend to be the type of violent person anyway, they're probably going to encourage the people around them to be violent people if it's mostly those people. So that they play off each other back and forth.
True statement. All right, so my second to last question. This is going to come to you, Malcolm. So there has been a huge stigma against those who are in the LGBTQ plus community about their mental health, how they are told they are not normal, and who they are, who they believe themselves to be is a figment of their imagination. People like to ask if they have had a good relationship with their parents or other somewhat intrusive questions that should be left to the experience of medical or mental health professionals who deal with this all the time. Is how the LGBTQ plus community treated more to do with their mental need for mental health treatment in your eyes? Essentially what I mean is like there are people out there that, you know, might that are transgender or asexual or whatever. And I'm not trying to, you know, be degrading about this, but it's just some people just, you know, think differently. They're members of the LGBTQ plus community and they're just told that there is something wrong with them and that, you know, they're treated poorly. And is it like their condition that is more mental health or how we treat them? Does that lead more to their need for mental health? So go ahead, Malcolm.
I think depending on the population that you're looking at, it's almost always going to be like societally influenced. So like if I think about like being trans, I think a lot of the issues that I have that stem from being trans come from like societal implications. Like one, that I have to be unhappy and I have to be miserable like all the time. That I probably like things that you mentioned, like maybe I don't have a good relationship with my parents. It's just kind of an acclamation of like there is something wrong with you and we're going to treat you like there's something wrong with you. And that kind of leads to like worse outcomes, right? Like if you have somebody that is like different and you treat them very differently, that kind of like amplifies the feelings of those differences. As far as like accessibility goes, we know that like LGBT people in general are usually less of means than non-LGBT people. The poverty rate in the trans community is really high. The unemployment rate in the trans community is really high. Insurance coverage for transgender related services are really difficult to access, especially if you're in a state that has like free market insurance where the insurances can deny transgender related services that can also amplify the distress. I think that a lot of it comes down to the idea, like you mentioned, that there's something wrong with us. And in turn, we internalize that. And then it kind of like amplifies those feelings that might have already been there. I could safely say that a lot of my issues are like societally enforced, that if there wasn't like this negative stigmatization around being trans or being gay or being bi or whatever sexuality / gender identity insert here, if those didn't exist, like the quality of life I think would skyrocket. I can't remember the guy's name off of my head. He's a trans guy who does research. I want to say it's in Belgium. I can't remember his name, but he asserts that like a lot of the suicidality that exists within the trans community is specifically linked to like ostracization and social circles and social interactions and stuff like that. So I think a lot of it comes from the way that we're treated. I don't really think that like innately like being gay or being trans has to have like this negative black mark of poor mental health. I think that a lot of it comes from how other people treat us.
Okay. Jason.
I had to run to unmute.
It's okay.
Yeah, I agree. When you ostracize somebody from society, there's bound to be some type of, abnormal behavior later on down the road, and some type of way that they're not going to be able to cope and deal with problems like the quote unquote normal people of society. So I don't think it's so much that people are born a certain way and there's something inherently wrong with them. I think it's people are born, they come to identify a certain way, and then we see that as weird. So we treat them differently, and then eventually they develop some type of mental health disorder, and lack of access to get help for that disorder perpetuates it.
Okay, Stardust.
Yeah, so I think you can look at this from not just the LGBTQ perspective, right? You can look at mental health in general, and you can definitely see a correlation where quality of life heavily affects how people do, and quality of life can aid in the progression of mental health decline. So you look at this from the perspective, again, like LGBTQ community, people who face a lot of rejection from their families and have less resources. You could look at it from the perspective of somebody who is growing up with very little means and has environmental pollution around them, and has no support system. You could look at it through the perspective of somebody growing up, or maybe not even that, like somebody in a domestic violence situation, right? So it is heavily correlated. Yeah.
Okay. Fresh.
Look, it's a two-way thing. You treat these people poorly, or you tell them there's something wrong with them, or you tell them their lifestyle is degenerate. You tell them that their lifestyle is affecting children wrong. It is mutilating children. It is a negative impact. And then they're more likely to have mental issues. The acceptance rates, the suicides rates among LGBTQ plus members, when they're like accepted or when they come out and they're in an accepting family, plummets. It's versus them, when they're hiding in the closet or they don't feel accepted. The other side to it is it's used as a cudgel to prove that the data is used as a cudgel to prove that what they are is wrong. For example, there was I swear to God, I wish I knew who this. I could remember this woman's name. She was a congressperson, running for a Republican congressperson. She was one of these ultra religious Christian people. Not to specifically say something's bad about her religion, but she was on a panel with Blair White, and her whole argument was she is a aggressive.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah, so you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So her argument was her lifestyle causes kids to have a higher suicide rate, and Blair never pushed back on the fact that just not is true. The higher their acceptance rate, the lower the suicide rate. The suicide rate correlating to LGBT plus people is not because they're LGBT plus, it's because of how they're treated. And constantly, the way that they're taught about it, that is bad, and this push to hide it from children, that if you teach about it to a child, it's ruining them forever, will make it worse because children don't know. Like if a child thinks that they have this issue or they don't feel right and they're in an area where, being gay is bad, where being trans is unacceptable, they're going to feel wrong and it's going to negatively affect them.
Okay, Phoenix.
Yeah, so the big like dunk here is that like the data pretty much confirms this. We can see that trans people who have one accepting family member go from a suicidality rate of 40% of trans people attempting suicide down to one of, I think, 8% is the number. It's below the average of the general population, which is 10%. So it does seem to have a lot more to do with alienation than actually being trans. That being said, well, I think that the link between queerness and mental health is often overhyped to demonize and to provide a conservative straw man. I would argue that gender itself only really exists as a form of trauma. So without getting too esoteric in that, I do think that having a queer relationship with gender is probably related to having to some extent not a normal relationship, or not actually that's not true. It would be a very normal relationship, but probably not necessarily a healthy relationship with one's own sex and the cultural norms that exist within it.
Okay, completely fair. Did anybody have anything more to add for this topic before we go into the final question for the evening?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Because
Sure.
Academic Punk, you said that like being queer is always framed around trauma. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
No, gender itself only exists as trauma. That is to say, like, not sex, obviously, but gender, the social roles that we create, aren't like a natural thing that, or again, natural is not the right word here, aren't the default, that gender itself exists as a set of norms that we are traumatized into performing. Again, it gets super fucking philosophically like way off into whatever, but I don't believe that queerness necessarily is related to trauma. I think that anybody who has a gender in general, like, probably has trauma around that, including cis people, like cishet, whatever. I think that in reality, it would actually be fair to say that like the closer we move to abolished gender, the less there will be around it. And I guess that would technically qualify as queer. But somebody who is less apathetic towards their gender is probably necessarily going to have a somewhat worse mental health relationship when it comes to the trauma surrounding gender.
I would love to unpack that suitcase, but I'm afraid we're just going to have to throw it away.
Yes, that seems like a way more of a philosophical discussion for another time.
Yeah, I didn't mean to get into too much of the esoterics of that.
That's okay.
That seems super deep, and maybe that's a good topic for another episode.
Quite possibly, yes. So, the last question for the evening before we go into final thoughts, and this is just kind of, this is gonna be kind of more of a personal answer for yourself, and we'll start with Phoenix once again. What do you think is the most under discussed mental health issue right now in the country, in your eyes? Do you think?
Right now, under discussed.
I don't know if that's a word really, but it's just like something that's not talked about enough or not emphasized enough. So.
No, yeah, I didn't. Sorry, I don't mean to be delaying like that.
That's okay.
I would say probably it's really hard to know for sure, given that data collection on mental health stuff is wild. Like, I don't know if you've seen the estimates for how many people might have DID, but it's between like 0.1% of the population and like 10% of the population. There's like no fucking clue. So again, it's really hard, but I'd say probably the most undiscussed thing is the class intersection. I think that people like to pretend, and I hear this a lot, right? Like depression is a luxury of the modern age or of rich people or of whatever, when that's just not true. The poor mental health correlates much more with the being within the lower classes.
Okay. Malcolm?
I think part of it is the idea that medical intervention, so like either in like the arena of like transgender health or the arena of like mental health in general, like pursuing like medical intervention, like maybe prescriptions or maybe surgery, like things like that, surgery more so like the trans thing. I don't think that we do like surgery for PTSD and stuff like that. But that those things are like bad, or that those things are like weak-minded, right? That you need like mood stabilizers or antidepressants or anything like that to function, that's framed as like a negative, or that you're like not able to do the work on your own to where you don't need the medication. I think that that's something that people that doesn't really get talked about. I know that there's like a big divide between like, like, oh, well, these are trees, these are my antidepressants, like trees will cure your depression, you don't need antidepressants. I think that we should normalize, or I think it's understated, that there are different routes of therapy or different routes of treatment for other people, and what might not be right for me might be right for somebody else. So the bastardization of like, oh, you have to take antidepressants, like what a pussy. Like I just went for a hike and I feel better. Just kind of normalizing. I don't think that we talk enough that like medical intervention is like really necessary for a lot of people, and it isn't a bad thing.
Okay, Stardust.
Yeah, so probably the healthcare system as a whole has a lot of things to be improved upon. Like I was saying earlier, accessibility is a huge issue. And when we have the infrastructure itself is failing and we've got people leaving the industry left and right, we already had a healthcare worker shortage to begin with, and now we have an even worse one. And this one is global, right? It's a global healthcare worker shortage. You can't even get to mental health, right? Can't even focus on specific areas at that point. I think that probably working on ways to reform the system, working on ways to provide accessibility to larger amounts of people, especially in rural areas and especially in underserviced communities, would be a great first step. And also encouraging people to go into these fields because there is just such a shortage right now. So,
okay, Fresh.
Yeah, I think honestly, probably she's Sardis is right. It's the lack of just general help for just overall medical care. We know we have food deserts, but we also have medical deserts, and they were referred to like kind of a little bit when they were talking about getting people the ability to get the vaccines, but it's not as robust as it should be. The way to deal with it, I think having telehealth does help it a little bit. But the actual physical, having physical doctors and stuff there, it's definitely a positive that we need more of.
Okay, Jason.
I'd say the first one is misinformation about mental health. So, all too often you hear people like, oh, you're okay, you're just borderline. You're not bipolar. And it's like, well, no, that person's not bipolar. You really don't know. You probably need a little more education about it. But I would like to see more research and study into personality disorders, because they're some of them are very treatable, but they're also very life altering for the people who suffer them. And I think that more research in that direction may be able to give us a way to help that segment of the population, those who are very affected by adaptive behaviors, and try to help them live a better and more productive life.
I agree. So Tara in the chat says, I would like to know the source for the earlier comment about the NFL allowing for a lower cognitive score for black players. Who said that earlier?
I did. Hold on. I can find that. Give me one.
Yeah, if you could just link it in the chat, I'd be grateful, and I'll just drop it in the YouTube chat. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and go into final thoughts, and you can say whatever you want to. You can say good panel, bad panel, or you can say like how you felt about the discussion that was done in here. You can say just whatever you want to, and you can plug yourself again to let everybody know where they can find you. So we will start with Stardust.
I'm sorry. Just to repeat again, you wanted me to plug myself?
No, just talk about like where they can find you. Like
oh, okay.
Yeah, well, whatever you want to say, like in the panel, it gives everybody the option to let everybody know where they are. So.
Yeah, sorry. What up, big pimps? I'm Stardust, STRDST _ at the end, because somebody already took STRGST. And you can find me on Twitch, and you can find me on Twitter. I do have a YouTube. I am not great about uploading at it, but hey, check me out. Sometimes I bring up really inappropriate and really uncomfortable topics. to talk with chat. So if you ever are into feeling very uncomfortable with me and it's just you and me, then
I appreciate it. Appreciate it. Phoenix, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Academic Punk 17. You can find me on Twitch and YouTube as Academic Punk 17. I also go by Phoenix and they, them pronouns. On the show, we do all sorts of politics stuff, mostly debates. However, we also play Minecraft some. We do some other gaming, cover news, and general Twitch politics drama stuff. So come stop by.
Fantastic. Malcolm.
I'm Malcolm. You can see him pronouns. I do trans political content all the time. Mostly I talk about transmasculine perspectives for trans-related things. I debunk a lot of TERF and gender critical talking points. And I host the only all trans mask everything panel on any platform ever, because so often trans men are left out of conversations about policy and prescriptions in relation to like transgender topics and things like that. So that's primarily, like almost exclusively what I do. So yeah, all my stuff is below. It's Goddammit Malcolm on YouTube. I'm most famous for debating Calvin Guerra on transmedicalism and destroying him with facts and logic. So I'm always down for spicy conversations and such. Thank you again, Alex, for reaching out. I very much so appreciate it, my friend.
Absolutely. I was glad to have you on here. Jason, go ahead.
Oh, final thoughts. I mean, to destigmatize mental health. I mean, it should be no different than going to see a doctor for a cold. I mean, it's no different than taking insulin for your diabetes. But yet, you know, we see it as different because we fear what's not known. So unfortunately, I don't have any way for people to follow me. I don't do YouTube, don't do Twitter, don't do any of that. But, you know, if you ever need to call, ever need to talk to somebody, if you feel alone, isolated, please reach out. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The number is 1-800-273-8255. If you're a veteran of the armed forces, that's one. You'll get routed over to the VA side.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for providing the number. Fresh. Finish it off.
Yeah, just very quickly, I dropped the first. It's NBC article is the first thing. If your chatter is curious about it, all they have to do is type in to NFL. I just typed in lower and it just popped up in the Google search bar for me, but you can find it through that. Anyway, I am Fresh Faces New Ideas. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/FreshFacesNewIdeas. You can find me on YouTube. Like Stardust, I don't use it enough. I did use it originally before I came to Twitch. Did not get the amount of people I liked on that, so I moved to Twitch and it worked much better. I also, you can find me on Twitter at Faces Ideas. You'll also see the link to my my Instagram there. I don't use that either. It's only for people who talk to me on podcasts. But yeah, I talk politics. And if you want to have a debate with me about things, let me know. I'll talk to anybody about most things. You know, sometimes I say I need a day or two to look into the topic. But yeah, I'm happy to be back here. I hope I come back to a fourth one. But yeah, please follow me around.
Yeah, y'all are welcome at any point. So once again, just I want to take time to thank the panelists. I mean, I feel like this was really good. It's good to have these kinds of discussions where everybody can just, you know, give their points of view on the topic at hand. And, you know, it's healthy to have these conversations because I just feel mental health as a whole is not talked about in general. And it's just people have their own opinions about like how we should view mental health. But some of the people that look at mental health as like a negative sense are also people that are not in the medical field or mental health field, honestly. And, you know, sometimes it's better to leave something like this to the experts, to the people that actually specialize in this, because after all, they're the ones that can do the diagnosis, not Joe Snuffy behind the computer because he read an article on some blog on Facebook about how they should view somebody who has a mental disorder. But I really do think that, you know, it's something that we do need to harp on a little bit more, something we do need to focus on. But, you know, once again, I just want to take the time. Once again, thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you so much for contributing to this panel this evening. I felt it was very, very healthy, and I learned quite a bit from it, from how everybody views mental health in general. So, but for everybody out there, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe. And be sure to go over and check out all the content on everybody else on the panelists on their pages. They put out good content, and I'm really glad that they took the time to come out to this panel. So thank you so much, everybody, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.